Good afternoon, everyone. I'm gonna give folks a couple more seconds to join in the room, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our concurrent session, Shaping Policy Through a Whole Child Lens. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be available to all conference registrants in the coming days. We encourage you to engage in the chat box during this session, highlighting your aha moments and your own state's best practices for whole child policymaking. Please also plug your questions into the Q&A tab at any point during the session, and we will get to as many as we can later on. I won't take a lot of time setting up the session because I want to make sure you hear the wealth of information our speakers have prepared to share with you today. But I will offer a few framing comments for your consideration. You know, when I began hearing the term whole child policy years ago, I thought it essentially meant social emotional learning, and that's it. It's only within the last couple of years that I've truly begun to deepen my understanding of the term. Whole child policymaking is not a single policy lever, not just SEL standards, not just multi-tiered systems of support, or just school meals and physical education. It's a broader approach to policymaking. Every single policy should be looked at through the lens of considering the impact it will have on a child's holistic development. We develop as people in the environments in which we live, through the experiences that we have, and opportunities and challenges that come our way. It's a constant evolution, and it's an interconnected process. Thus, we must think of policy as working in an ecosystem, and we must create a healthy ecosystem in which every student can thrive. Ask yourself, what kind of school would you want for your own child? What kind of education would you want for your niece or nephew? I would imagine that's an education and an environment that provides rich academic development, social and emotional development, physical development, cognitive development, and more. Now translate that to how are you making sure that every student receives what they need to be successful to achieve that same excellent education. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our excellent guest speakers today. First, you'll hear from Dr. Benard Dreyer, who is the professor of pediatrics at NYU and leads the Division of Developmental-Behavioral Pediatrics. Second, you'll hear from Charlene Russell Tucker, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Education for the Connecticut State Department of Education, a role in which she oversees educational supports and wellness priorities. She's a great friend of NASBE's and participated in last year's NASBE SEL network. Last but not least, you'll hear from Kathy Bush, who is the chair of the Kansas State Board of Education and is a current member of NASBE's Whole Child Policy Study Group. Thank you all again for joining today, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Dreyer.
Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. The topic of my talk is how poverty affects students, their families, and schools. And I'm just going to dive right in since we don't have much time here. So, it's my pleasure to be here talking to all of you. So a few words about child poverty and how we measure it. So this looks at child poverty in the US. It's based on what people ate in 1963 multiplied by 3. That's when the poverty level was invented. And it was the USDA Thrifty Food Budget minimal level of food. You can see that as of 2019, about 15% of children are poor, as opposed to less than 9% of the elderly. And so this gives you a sense that children are the poorest age group in our society. In addition, there is There are racial and ethnic disparities in poverty, as you can see here. Black children and Native American children are about 32% of them are poor. Latinx children about 26%, and white children about 11%. There's also, in addition to income poverty, which is what you just looked at, there's a gap in family net worth by race, ethnicity. In general, the median value of family net worth, which is how much money they have saved, what they own in, cars, houses, etc. For white non-Hispanic families, it's about 10 times as much as for Black or African American or Hispanic or Latinx families. You can see this looks at the range of poverty. So starting with below 50%, which is severe poverty, all the way up to about 200% poverty. And you can see that at each of these levels of poverty, children are the poorest group in our society. I also just want to briefly talk about the basic needs budget. So in thinking about what a living wage is, it's what you need to just put food on the table, pay your rent, pay for the heating, some clothes for your to cover your backs and your children's backs, etc. And you can see that this varies around the country, but at the lowest level in Mississippi, at the lightest level there, it's about $50,000 a year, whereas the poverty level is really about $24,000 a year. So you can see that at least 200% of the federal poverty level is needed just for a family to meet its basic needs. And so we generally think of 200% of the federal poverty level as being the true level of poverty in our society. And that means, of course, about twice as many children are really poor. I want to briefly talk a little about neurodevelopment and toxic stress. So neurodevelopment results from the ongoing and cumulative interactions between experience, biology, and behavior. You can see experience at the top, which can be either protective and personal or insecure and impersonal. At the bottom is behavior, which can be adaptive with healthy coping skills or maladaptive with unhealthy coping skills. And so there is either a virtuous or vicious cycle to this. So in the vicious cycle part, bad experiences lead to maladaptive behavior in children, which then feed back to worsen the experiences. In a virtuous cycle, protective and nurturing experiences lead to adaptive and healthy behavior, which then again feeds back to experience and it makes it even more nurturing and protective. You can see in the middle there is brain development. So experience works on behavior through alterations in the brain structure and function. And to some degree, these are through epigenetic changes, which are alterations in the way the genetic program is read. It's not changes in the actual genes, but turning on or turning off genes based on either positive or negative experiences. Brains are built over time. As you can see, at the earliest ages, sensory pathways are laid down for vision and hearing. Then comes language. Finally, there are higher cognitive functions, and you can see they tail off in adolescence, but in fact, if we extended that line, they would go through certainly early adulthood. So there's continuing but development of cognitive functions through early adulthood. Why early experiences matter. This shows us the newborn brain, which is about 1/3 the size and the weight of a 2-year-old brain. And frankly, your brain doesn't grow that much more after 2 years of age. This looks at the dramatic growth of neuronal architecture from birth to 2 years, which mirrors the brain growth. You can see from sparse connections between neurons, synapses, to a very highly complex connections at about 2 years of age. It's not just increased synapses, but also pruning away of those connections that are not necessary and strengthening of those connections that are important for language, learning, and cognition. There are 700 new synapses created each second in the early years, which is sort of an amazing number to think about. It sort of blows my mind away every time I read this. Now let's get to toxic stress. Fighting this orderly development of the brain is toxic stress, which is strong, frequent, or prolonged activation of the body's stress response systems without, in the absence of buffering protection of a supportive adult relationship. And toxic stress may lead to permanent changes in brain structure and function due to the abundant glucocorticoid receptors found in these 3 areas of the brain: the prefrontal cortex, which is shown at the top, and the prefrontal cortex is the center of executive functions. It regulates thoughts, emotions, actions. Then there's the amygdala, which is actually the emotional center of the brain, which triggers emotional responses in the kid. And then the hippocampus, which is the center for memory, is so important to learning. And as you can see, toxic stress ends up decreasing both the volume and also the functioning in the prefrontal cortex, as well as the hippocampus, just the areas you need to function well in school. But in fact, enhances the connections in the amygdala and enlarges the amygdala, meaning that the child will be more likely to have poor control over emotions and be very reactive to emotions without the control of the part of the brain that controls that, which is primarily the prefrontal cortex. Childhood poverty is associated with ACEs, environmental risks, food insecurity, and homelessness. And so ACEs lead to toxic stress. And these are the 10 ACEs that are being measured in children in the National Study of Child Health. This was measured in 2011 and 12, and then 2016 and 17. And they are economic hardship or poverty, divorce or separation of parents, death of a parent, parents serve time in jail, witnessing adult domestic violence, victim or witness to neighborhood violence, living with somebody who has mental illness or who has drug and alcohol problems, and being judged for their racial or ethnic background. There is a 10th ACE, which is, of course, being a victim of child abuse. But of course, this was asked of parents, so they obviously could not ask parents, are you abusing your kids? So what is the relationship between ACEs to poverty? This looks at how many of these children had 2 or more ACEs. And you can see that for those living below the poverty line, about 35% had 2 or more ACEs. But of course, when you get to a much higher income at 400% of the poverty line, about 10% of kids have 2 or more ACEs. So there is a definite linear relationship between poverty and the number of adverse childhood experiences leading to toxic stress that children are exposed to. Poverty also increases exposure to environmental toxins. This looks at the scandal in Flint, Michigan. And those red areas in the city of Flint on the left are the poor areas of town, but also the same areas that were exposed to lead in the water. You can see Flint water looking pretty horrible versus Detroit water, which looking pretty clear. So, and not only to lead, which we know is a neurotoxin and causes significant problems in the child's cognition. There are other toxins that children are exposed to more frequently if they are poor, including air pollution, etc. And of course, food insecurity in poverty is associated with poverty level. You can see here that in the blue bar on the left, almost 50% of children who are poor are food insecure, whereas when you get to greater than 200% of federal poverty level, in purple, less than 8% are food insecure. And we know from research that food insecurity is associated with academic and psychosocial problems. And of course, family homelessness is really only a problem of poor families. And this has been dramatically increasing over the years from 1 in 50 children in 2006. You can see here it's 1 in 30 in 2013. And I think it's even more frequent today. We used to talk about double jeopardy, meaning that poor children also had health problems, putting them at double jeopardy, but in fact, it's really a pile on of multiple jeopardies. You can see here in this diagram that poor children also have more ACEs and toxic stress, more food insecurity and iron deficiency, more lead and other toxins. They also have increased low birth weight impacting neurodevelopment, increased chronic diseases such as asthma, increased accidental injury, poorer access to healthy foods and healthy play areas, of course, increased homelessness and substandard housing, and government neglect and incompetence. So how does this impact their neurodevelopment and their child's potential for academic success? These are 2 studies that looked at brain functional MRIs to point out that children who are poor have different brain structures than children who are not poor, including a decreased surface area and decreased volume of various parts of the brain. This is from Kim Noble's study from Teachers College in New York. These are scans of the brain and looking at differences in surface area, different parts of the brain. And you can see the largest differences are in red. And you can see that the temporal lobes, the frontal lobes, and the prefrontal cortex are all very much decreased in surface area in children who are poor. This looks at total brain area with children in poverty from 4 months to 4 years. And again, at high SES, you can see the green line is by 3 years of age is significantly has more volume in the gray matter than the blue line at the bottom for low SES. These disparities begin very early. This is a famous study by Hart and Risley that measured what families were talking to their kids, how much talking, and what the child's language included. And you can see here, this looks at the child's cumulative vocabulary from birth to about 3 years of age. And you can see that pretty much at the time that language emerges at about 15, 16 months of age, there is a beginning of a separation from higher educated and higher wealth families from poor families at the bottom. So there's a very significant difference, of course, by about 3 years of age. This is the so-called 30 million word gap, which is talked about. This is from the Hart and Risley study. Basically, this is the estimated cumulative words addressed to the child by people in the household. And you can see again, by about 4 years of age, there's a 30 million word gap between a higher educated and wealthier families to poorer families at the bottom. And it's not just the number of words, but the richness of the language and the encouragement of the language with positive reinforcement and expansion of what the child is saying. So where does this lead? This leads to the fact that most academic disparities are present at school entry. So this looks at math percentile ranks. And you can see that most of the difference between, this was measured between 6 and 12 years of age. And on the bottom in red is the lowest income quartile, and green at the top is the highest. And you can see that most of the difference that's there at 12 years of age is already there at school starting at 6. And by the 3rd grade, pretty much things are pretty much set. And that's why, of course, 3rd and 4th grade reading levels are often measured, because they are very predictive of later academic outcomes. This is looking at reading levels as opposed to math scores. Again, you can see the same pattern from high SES at the top to low SES at the bottom. And you can see that most of the difference is there when children begin school at about 6 years of age. Researchers have Greg Duncan and his colleagues have looked at the persistence of these gaps from kindergarten to the 5th grade. And you can see in the same kids, those that reading achievement gaps where richer kids did a lot better than poorer kids were persistent or perhaps even increased. Engagement in school, likewise. And then on the negative side, poorer kids had more antisocial behavior and mental health problems, both of which persisted from kindergarten to 5th grade. Part of the problem is not just early childhood or schooling, but in fact, the parents' abilities to provide for their children. So this looks at how much the poorest 20% of families in gray, light gray, can provide for their child in enrichment, such as going to museums, buying books, going to the zoo, having just enriching experiences in life. And you can see that the poorest families in 1972, 1973 had about 1/4 to 1/5 the expenditure, but by 2005, 2006, the difference was dramatically increased to about 10 to 1 from 4 to 5 to 1. And I'm sure by now it's even more disparate. So poverty, one of the ways that poverty impacts children is the resources that they really can be given by their families. These impacts last into adulthood and are intergenerational. So this looks at children who with low and higher levels of early childhood poverty. You can see that in yellow are the kids that had higher poverty levels or lower income in early childhood. And you can see that when they grow up to be adults, they make up less than half as much as those with higher incomes, more likely to have food stamp receipts, more likely to be in poor health. If they're women, they're more likely to have non-marital births, and not shown here is, of course, more incarceration for poor kids and more psychological trauma. I want to briefly focus on the COVID-19 pandemic because, of course, we're all dealing with that. But this has actually led to further disparities between rich and poor kids because of the reliance on Zoom, as we are relying on it today, and other video conference methods, assumes access to broadband. And in New York, this is just data from New York City, 31% of households in New York City do not have broadband, but actually 56 in the lowest income group do not have broadband. They also have crowding, noisy environments without private space to focus. And so therefore educational disparities may increase. Just to look at this graph, you can see the poorest group, those without broadband are about 56% in the dark blue. But when you get to a higher income, only a small percentage don't have access to broadband, and the vast majority, 90%, have access. So this disparity is, of course, affecting the ability to do virtual schooling, which has been already impactful, and I'm sure that you're all dealing with this. And therefore, one of the things we need to do is try to correct this disparity as we go into the future, because virtual schooling is probably going to be a part of our educational system for quite a while. So what are some promising school interventions that we should mention? And I'll finish on these slides. First, of course, interventions in early childhood before school begins. As I showed you, so much of the problems that kids have in school, really they bring with them to school at the start of school in kindergarten. So although we want to do things in school, it's really too late to make major interventions if we don't start earlier. And so some of the things that we want to encourage are home visiting programs. These are the maternal child health evidence-based home visiting programs that have been shown to really improve language and other cognitive aspects, as well as emotional aspects of children. Reach Out and Read, which is an intervention in primary care where counseling and books are given out at every well child visit, has also evidence-based and has been shown to really improve language before school begins and even before preschool begins. So a lot of these programs start at birth, And so even before preschool, we can reach kids through either home visiting or primary care pediatrics, where most kids really are going for vaccinations, et cetera. And the third program is, of course, the Video Interaction Project. This is something we developed here, but has now gone nationwide and really works at, again, at every well-child visit with parents in a partnership with parents to empower them to do more with play and reading at home. And this is actually a scene from Flint, Michigan. We actually have a program in Flint based on the lead toxic scandal that occurred there. And this is a scene from an interventionist. Well, this is a parent and child, and the interventionist is videotaping and then reviewing the videotape with the parent. Also, I think before I get to school, bridging the digital divide is important. As I mentioned, we should make broadband internet access a national priority. It's not only poor people in urban areas, and many of my parents that I follow don't have internet access, but rural areas, of course, are a problem as well. We need to develop or support digital health equity, similar to that created by the Greenlining Institute of California. I encourage you to look up greenlining in Google and learn about what that institute is doing in California about digital health equity. We need to target funds from COVID stimulus packages and again, in general, for telemedicine and also teleeducation to improve computer ownership in low-income communities. We need to reinstate the Department of Education Community Technology Centers that created and expanded spaces for greater access to information technology and the training to use it in low-income communities. And of course, in addition to education, health systems can leverage community health workers to help low digital literacy families with the basics of using a computer or smartphone device. There are actually many promising interventions in the educational system. This book, Restoring Opportunity by Greg Duncan and Richard Murnane, talks about 3 areas. First, it looks at a promising preschool program in the Boston Public Schools, which was based on choosing a strong curricula, teacher training and support, and time for that, expectations for results, measurement to see that those results were happening, and of course, play and fun, since kids at this age learn from play, not from didactics. There are also promising elementary school programs. One example that they focus on is the Chicago Charter Schools, which had a coordinated focus on literacy across grades, regular assessments of student skills, and the use of those results of those assessments to guide improvement and remediation on an individual basis. And finally, there are promising high school programs, the New York City Small High School Program, which it focuses on literacy across the grades, expectations for success and support to make up for family and social problems, attention to adolescent development, involvement of community partners, and then acculturation of those high school kids into college attendance. I'm going to end right there because I do want to give time for the other speakers to talk and for us to have a question and answer period. So I'm going to end with this quote from Frederick Douglass. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So thank you very much. We'll have questions and answers later. And I'm now going to turn the podium, so to speak, over to Charlene Russell Tucker. So take it away, Charlene.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dreyer. I'm also going to share my screen if I get the option to do so.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I think I'm there. Can folks see my screen, I hope? Let's make sure we can do that. All right, I'm going to make sure that I'm sharing. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Dreyer and Megan. Thank you so much for the invitation to share Connecticut State Department of Education's perspective with you today. You know, as I was listening to Dr. Dreyer, I am hoping for our participants that it seems like there's so much, and if you're not careful, it seems as though it's insurmountable. However, there is a way for us to work together, and especially state education agencies and our State Board of Education, to address these issues head on. So thank you for the opportunity to share that. What you have on the screen, and it is from the website, which you can also see there from the CDC's website, and that is the whole school, a whole community, whole child model that was developed. And this is the construct and the backdrop that we use in Connecticut to help to bring a systematic process when we think about the whole child. This, as you can see, this graphic, which was developed by health professionals and public health and education professionals to strengthen a unified and collaborative approach to improve learning and health in our nation's schools. It is a very dynamic, as you can see, visual and compelling visual to organize what a comprehensive whole school approach looks like in meeting the needs of the whole child. So when you think about the strategies that Dr. Dreyer just talked about, this is one way and one construct of bringing them together in a very organized way so we can address it and develop policies in a very systematic process. I will share with you just a few of the things just pulling out from this model that we've implemented in our state in collaboration with our department and with our state Board of Education. And so I'm clicking on counseling, psychological, and social services. And just earlier this month at our state board meeting, our state board adopted the Connecticut Comprehensive School Counseling Framework, which will now be made available. It's updated from a previous version that delivers a range of evidence-based supports, programs, and services to address the needs of our students. It is with a strong equity focus to address the needs of historically marginalized and vulnerable student population. And so we're really pleased that that's there. It also addresses the issue of attendance and the issue of school discipline, really very important parts of our work. And our state board has actually used the lever of improving attendance and also to address exclusionary discipline as a part of the board's comprehensive plan that we work on together. The next component that I wanted to just talk a bit about is social, emotional, and climate and what we've done there. In 2018, our state board adopted a position statement in school emotion and social, emotional, and intellectual habits for all students, K through 3. And that position statement complements our department's kindergarten through grade 3 SEL standards. And right now we're working on 4 through 12. The other component that I wanted to talk about here just briefly is family engagement. As Dr. Dreyer talked about the family and what's going on there, that's an area that we've worked on as well. And we recognize the importance of family engagement. And so we've worked with families and educators to create a framework and definition for family engagement in Connecticut that emphasizes that all families are full, equal, and equitable partners in their children's education. We did this work through the Commissioners Roundtable for Family and Community Engagement in Education, whose purpose was to advise the Commissioner of Education around programming and policies to improve outcomes for all students and also to advance our State Board of Education's comprehensive plan for equity and excellence. And so we have a Connecticut definition of family engagement, which is a full, equal, and equitable partnerships among families, educators, and community partners to promote children's learning and development from birth through college and career. And there's also a set of guiding principles that address that as well. And last but not least, the issue of nutrition. I know Dr. Dreyer talked about food insecurity. Nutrition or nutrition environment and services, something that we've worked on. We've actually leveraged this whole child, whole school, whole community model to district wellness policies and practices, which were required since 2006 by the US Department of Agriculture in our school nutrition programs. And we've partnered, talk about community partnerships, with our University of Connecticut here to look at the policies that were developed so we could provide really some best practices and support to districts as they're implementing these policies. And finally, Dr. Dreyer also talked about COVID-19 and its impact. We know the impact that it's had on our educational system and our young people. And the America's Promise Alliance did a representative survey in June of 2020 and of high school students. And it was interesting that one of the findings, 52% more, they're 52% more concerned right now than usual about health, about their family financial situation, about basic needs, food, medicine, and safety. So I'm really very proud of our agency and our staff in our nutrition space that worked with our school districts since March and they've served over 13 million meals, which is so critically important as we go forward. So I hope that these few examples will show how these components, there are 10 components in this model. You've seen just a blip of what we're doing here in 4 of those spaces, but I hope that it shows how this concept can be used as an organizing construct of what's possible with the State Department of Education and the State Board of Education working systematically and working together in order to address these issues. I believe it's a moral imperative. And I value our state board. When I looked earlier, I know one of our board members was on, but that we have a state board, an active legislative and policy development committee that leans in on all these issues. And I'm going to end with the introduction of our state board's policy comprehensive plan states that the promise of an excellent public education is to equip every child, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, family wealth, zip code, or disability status, with the knowledge and skills necessary to succeed in college, careers, and civic life. I really think it takes this village of the Department of Education, along with our state board, community partners, and there's a host of things that we've been able to do together with community partners. As you see, the community is a part of this, and the outcome is healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenge young people if we're able to do this well. So thank you for the opportunity to give you at a very high level a few things that we're doing with using this model as a construct when we think about whole schools, whole community, and whole child. So with that, I will turn things over to my colleague, Kathy.
Thank you, Charlene. I really appreciate you sharing what Connecticut's doing. I enjoyed that presentation. I'm going to share a little bit about the Kansas role, the Kansas mission of where we're going. I am on the State Board of Education. We have 10 members. A number of my colleagues, I believe, are on this call. So they'll be listening to me and watching me. And if I didn't get it right, I'm sure they'll correct me. But go ahead and move it to the next one, Megan, if you would. Next slide, hopefully. I'll go ahead and talk a little bit while she moves that. The State Board of Education in Kansas, we do have 10 members. We each represent 4 state Senate seats. And we started this most recent initiative that we're working on back in 2015, where we are going to have We had a new commissioner, we hired a new commissioner, and we really wanted to get out around the state. I don't know, Megan, do you have to move this? We wanted to get out around the state to listening sessions throughout the state, and we wanted to see what folks had to say about where our Kansas schools are now and where we wanted to move. And so we had an opportunity to go out with our new commissioner and our deputy commissioner. State board members went to as many of these sessions as we could, and we went out around the state to 20 different sites and to hear what they had to say, to hear what our communities had to say. And what we did was we asked 3 questions, and I'm just going to really focus on the first question is, what do you see as a successful 24-year-old? So we asked those questions at these 20 sites, and these were mostly community members, teachers, and so on, that provided us with information that we wanted to hear. So we brought that information back. This was the largest qualitative study done in the state of Kansas. Next slide, please. So we were able to take a look at the feedback from that particular opportunity, and what the folks told us was that they felt like this was business and industry. We did have the community. I don't know if we can find this is not going. Let's go back a little bit, Megan, if you would. One more, please. And one more. There we go. Okay, this was the data from the first focus group, and these responses were what characteristics of success were most frequently cited. And they cited academic skills. So we were doing what folks wanted us to do as far as academics were concerned. But then they said, okay, we need 70% said non-academic skills. Now you can define non-academic skills a lot of ways. Folks will say employability skills, soft skills, so on. A lot of this is social emotional support. So this kind of information was what we felt like this said is, okay, we're doing a pretty good job with our academic skills. We need to continue to focus on that, but we need to up our game in our non-academic skills. Now, what we found when we went around the state was we got a lot of community members. We didn't get enough business members. So on the next slide, we'll show you the data that has to do with the businesses. We went back throughout the state and we hit 7 different chamber of commerces from throughout the state, from our bigger communities to our small communities. And we asked the same questions. What kind of data can you tell us that you see? So the next slide, if you can, Megan. I know this isn't quite the model we wanted, but hey, it's working. Well, it's very interesting. The business communities told us that the question was, the business and industry focus group cited non-academic skills with greater frequency than the community group. So they said, we're doing a good job. 15% said we needed to focus on academic school skills, but a whopping 81% said we needed more focus on our non-academic skills. Okay, so we took all that data as a state board and we made some decisions based on that data after that data was compiled. Go ahead and go to, okay. Next slide, please. One of the first things we did was we wanted to take a look at what is a successful Kansas high school graduate. We had the academic preparation, the cognitive preparation, the technical skills, and the employability skills. One component we added to that was civic engagement. So we had an additional component that our data showed us that we needed to add to that. And then our vision, if you'd go to the next slide, Megan. We defined a new vision for Kansas schools, and the vision was Kansas leads the world in the success of each student. The word each was very important. And then next slide, please. And so what we did was we identified 5 goal areas, 5 outcomes. You see kindergarten readiness. Now, you know, in Kansas, the state board actually has focus over K-12, but we worked with our partners and we're really doing a lot of work in the area of kindergarten readiness. We have a tool here that's measuring this. And then we established that we were going to have individual plans of studies for all of our students. So starting in at least grade 7 up through 12, the students had to have an individual plan of study. We gave the districts a tool to use this. We continue to focus on high school graduation rate. That we have that throughout the state. The new one was post-secondary completion and attendance. We broadened the definition. We certainly are continuing to focus on high school, but we also want to focus on our post-secondary to include the community and the technical schools. And we have a data point to focus on the post-secondary. We call it post-secondary success. We use the student clearinghouse data to be able to show this as a measurement tool. And then our 5th goal area was social and emotional growth. So we wanted to look at our social and emotional piece, but we did want it measured locally. So we do look at that piece, and we look at all 5 of these outcome areas in our data when we measure our local districts, and we look at these annually. So this is a mission that we are on. To improve all of our schools through these measurable outcomes through Kansas. So we look at, certainly academics continue to be important, but our non-academic skills are social and emotional and how our students are doing. So final slide, and I probably went a little tiny bit over, but there we go. That's a little bit of the Kansas story. So I'll turn it back over to Megan. I think she's gonna maybe have a little bit of time for questions. So Megan.
Thanks, Kathy. And I'll ask, yep, Charlene and Dr. Dreyer to go ahead and turn on your video as well. Kathy, big props to you for continuing to move with grace and collegiality as I struggled with the slides there. So I appreciate your kindness there. And thank you all for your great presentations. I'm going to read off in the time that we have some of the questions that have been posed by attendees, and I encourage others who have not yet posed their questions to go ahead and do that. The first question coming up, and you know what I'm realizing? Apologies, I think my computer's freezing as I have too many tabs open. Okay, so the first question is for Dr. Dreyer from Pamela Davis-Vaught, who is a Virginia State Board of Education member and a current elementary school principal, and also a member of NASBE's Whole Child Policy Study Group. She asked, what guidance would you give states on creating remote learning policies such as computer time, age, time appropriateness, based on brain development and health, especially for children who may have experienced a high number of ACEs?
Yes, that's a great question. Of course, that's about the answer could take about an hour, but I will give a short answer, and I think it is the question, I think, for all of us, to be honest. I think for young children, distance virtual learning is hard. I think attention span is low, and also they really need that concrete connection with a teacher and with playthings. I think for school age kids, the difficulties are certainly going to be with those who have problems like ADHD and also developmental delays of any kind. My own experience with my patients is that it also depends very much on the involvement of the parents at home. So for those parents who either are working at home and can spend time supporting their child, it works out very well. But for other children who are kind of left to their own devices, especially in a crowded home, it is really not working out well. But I think in general, as I said, we need to get everybody high-speed internet access if really we're going to be expanding, and at least an iPad, if we're going to be expanding virtual learning. I know that in New York City, they're trying to give every child in the school system an iPad. I don't know how successful that's going to be, but I think that is one of the ways they're going to try to extend virtual learning to those children.
Thank you, Dr. Dreyer. Another stellar question from Pam for Kathy. So in what ways is your board assessing the success of the 10 components you outlined during your presentation?
We actually, except for the social emotional, we actually have an assessment for each one of those. Social and emotional, we felt like that's not the state's business to know how social emotional growth is. We have an expectation, and each of those districts are supposed to have their own growth measurement tool, and they do, so we check on that, but we don't want them to turn that data into us. We have an expectation that they have that data tool and that they use it, and they're figuring out ways to work with their children. But our kindergarten readiness, we do have a tool, and you'd ask me what it is. It's got the SQR3. I may have those letters backwards or upside down or inside out, but we do have a tool that we use for our preschool before our kids get into kindergarten, and we do look at that data. Our individual plans of study, we use a couple of tools that the districts can use for individual plans of study, and we do monitor that they're using those and that they're making progress with our kids. And the high school graduation is the high school graduation rate. And then our post-secondary readiness piece, we have created a very interesting data set with this. This has kind of been a Kansas thing, and we've created this. That's been, we measure post-secondary success. And again, we look at the student clearinghouse data, and our data point is looking at 2 years after high school. Are those students either still in post-secondary, or have they already achieved either a degree from a technical college, community college, or do they have industry recognized certificates? So if they meet those data points, then we are able to look at that and determine success. So if you go on our website, you can see that data point. And it's a very interesting data point. It'd take a lot longer to describe, and I'd actually have my commissioner do that rather than me. So we are looking at all 5 of those pieces.
Thanks, Kathy. And Charlene, I'm actually just going to dig a little bit deeper into how you've built up such a great, stellar relationship with your board. Kathy, spoke about her work and working with constituents across the state and garnering their input. But, I know that it's really central to you and your efforts and how you lead to make sure that you're working in great partnership with your board. So if you could just highlight why that's important, and perhaps if a board is interested in developing stronger relationships with their SCA staff, how might they go about doing that?
So thank you, Megan, for that question, because I think it's critically important for us to be working together. It's also an accountability feature, and I see, Kathy nodding her head, because I also think about it from the standpoint of that it's also about accountability for the work that we're doing. But the open lines of communication, I think, is critically important. So in the agency, I know we're constantly thinking about what it is that the board needs to know to be able to make sure that board members have the information. So we have new data, example, attendance data or discipline data, to make sure that comes in front of the board, even if it is not something that's required anywhere, to say, let's update the board, let's take this information to the board and help to use that as a standpoint of then helping the board figure out what is the piece they need to do, for example, a position statement or other policy levers, and then what it is that we need to do. So keeping the lines of communication open, I think, is critically important in doing that both ways. It's not unlike, get a phone call from a board member saying, oh, I just read this in the paper today, like what's going on? And so we can have that back and forth, which I think is critically important. So keeping open lines of communication even when the news may not be good. You know, it's like when you get the data and you recognize, oh my goodness, it's not what we were looking for, that you can go and have that conversation with the board to explain where we are. You take the questions and then figure out the path forward. So I would say effective communication is really critically important.
Thanks, Shirley. Especially probably when the news is not good. You want to go ahead and share that in advance before they're surprised by the news. You know, I hate to do this, everyone. I feel like I really just shortchanged y'all when it came to the Q&A because we've hit our time and I only got to ask each speaker one question. But I hope all the attendees did find this helpful. I hope you all as speakers found this to be a good and use of your time. I would ask that attendees please rate this session. You'll see a tab right below the screen of the video. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, if you hope to see this topic elevated again, and if you have any lingering questions, either for our experts here or that we as NASBE staff can help you out with. And I would just encourage you all to remember there's a networking break for the next half hour, and we encourage you to connect with your fellow conference attendees during that time. So thank you all for joining, and thank you to our speakers. We can't just say thank you enough. So have a great afternoon, everyone.
Great session and pleasure to be here.